Welcome, friends, to a journey into the darkest corners of the human soul. Tonight, we delve into a tale so chilling it will frost your veins and make you question the smiles of those you think you know. We present a story of a quiet town, a beloved butcher, and a secret ingredient that turned a local delicacy into an abomination. This is a story that will haunt your dreams and linger in your thoughts long after the screen goes dark. Before we begin this descent into madness, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you these tales of horror and suspense. Click that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and brace yourselves for the Twisted Killer Sausages made from human flesh, a shocking tale of horror and madness. And now let the story begin. The town of Havenwood was, by all accounts, an idyllic slice of Americana. Nestled in a valley cradled by a whispering, ancient pine forest, it was the kind of place where everyone knew your business, or so they thought. The town square, with its quaint gazebo and a stern-looking statue of its founder, Ebenezer Croft, was the community's heart. It was here that neighbors exchanged pleasantries, children chased pigeons, and the scent of freshly baked bread from Mrs. Gable's bakery mingled with the sweet perfume of blooming petunias. But another aroma, a richer, more savory one, often drifted across the square, a scent that had become synonymous with Havenwood itself. The irresistible smell of Bartholomew, the butcher's world-famous sausages. Bartholomew's Meats and Charcuterie was a Havenwood institution. A portly man with a perpetually rosy-cheeked smile and a twinkle in his eye, Bartholomew was as much a fixture of the town as the old clock tower. His shop was a relic of a bygone era, with its checkered tile floor, a long marble countertop, and gleaming brass hooks from which hung various cuts of meat. But it was the sausages that had made him a legend. People came from neighboring towns, and even from the city an hour's drive away, to purchase Bartholomew's creations. They came in all varieties: a spicy Italian, a robust bratwurst, a sweet and smoky applewood smoked link, and the most coveted of all, the Havenwood Special, a secret recipe passed down through his family, or so the story went. The Havenwood Special was the stuff of myth. Its flavor was complex, rich, and utterly unique. It was the centerpiece of every town barbecue, the star of countless Sunday breakfasts, and the comfort food many Havenwood residents turned to in times of both joy and sorrow. When asked about his secret ingredient, Bartholomew would simply chuckle, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake his entire corpulent frame, and say, "Well, it wouldn't be a secret if I told you, would it? A magician never reveals his tricks." The townsfolk would laugh along with him, content in their ignorance, savoring the meaty, slightly sweet, and utterly addictive flavor of his sausages. Among Bartholomew's most loyal customers was Sheriff Brody, a man who had seen nothing more dramatic than a few bar brawls and a string of teenage vandalism in his 20 years of service in Havenwood. Brody was a man who appreciated the simple, predictable rhythm of small-town life. His morning routine was as regular as the sunrise. A coffee from the diner, a quick chat with the mayor, and a stop at Bartholomew's for a pound of the Havenwood Special. He'd often stay to chat, leaning against the counter as Bartholomew expertly ground meat, mixed spices, and stuffed casings with a practiced, almost artistic grace. "Morning, Bart," Brody would say, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Sheriff," Bartholomew would boom in reply, his smile never faltering. "The usual? You know it. The wife would have my hide if I came home without it. Says it's the only thing that makes my cooking edible." Bartholomew would let out a hearty laugh and wrap the links in crisp, white butcher paper, tying it with a neat red string. The exchange was a familiar dance, a small but essential part of the comfortable tapestry of Havenwood life. The first thread to unravel from that tapestry was the disappearance of Old Man Hemlock. A recluse who lived on the outskirts of town in a dilapidated shack, Hemlock was a known eccentric. He'd wander into town once a month for supplies, his long, gray beard matted and his eyes wild with a paranoia that only years of isolation could cultivate. He'd mutter about government conspiracies and aliens in the woods, and most of the townsfolk gave him a wide berth. So, when he missed his monthly trip to the general store, no one thought much of it. Probably holed up with a fresh batch of moonshine, Mayor Thompson had commented with a dismissive wave of his hand. But a week turned into 2, then a month, and even the most dismissive in town began to feel a small prickle of unease. Sheriff Brody, prompted by a few concerned citizens, drove out to Hemlock's shack. The place was unnervingly silent. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, a layer of dust coated every surface, and a half-eaten can of beans sat on the table, a fork still sticking out of it. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of foul play. Old Man Hemlock had simply vanished. The town buzzed with speculation for a few weeks. Theories ranged from a bear attack to an alien abduction, the latter being a popular one among the town's more imaginative teenagers. But with no evidence to go on, the talk eventually died down, and Hemlock's disappearance simply became another piece of local folklore, a ghost story to be told around campfires. It was around this time that Bartholomew introduced a new sausage to his collection. He called it the Hunter's Delight. It was a gamier, richer sausage, with a deep, earthy flavor that was an instant hit. When asked what kind of game was in it, Bartholomew would just wink and say, "A little of this, a little of that, a secret of the hunt." The townsfolk, ever trusting of their beloved butcher, didn't press the issue. They were too busy enjoying the new delicacy. A few months later, a traveling salesman named Arthur Penwright passed through Havenwood. He was a slick, fast-talking man with a suitcase full of cheap watches and a talent for charming his way into a free meal. He stayed in town for a few days, frequenting the local tavern, regaling the regulars with tales of his travels. He was last seen leaving the tavern, slightly inebriated, and heading in the direction of the boarding house where he was staying. He never arrived. His car was found a week later, abandoned on a lonely stretch of road a few miles out of town. Of Arthur Penwright, there was no sign. Sheriff Brody conducted a more thorough investigation this time. He interviewed everyone who had spoken to Penwright, searched his abandoned car, and even organized a search party to comb the woods. But it was as if the man had been wiped from existence. The disappearance was unsettling, a stark contrast to the peaceful, predictable nature of Havenwood. A sense of unease, a shadow of fear, began to creep into the idyllic town. And then, Bartholomew unveiled another new sausage. This one he called the Traveler's Treat. It had a slightly spicy, exotic flavor that no one could quite place. It was delicious, of course. Everything Bartholomew made was delicious. But this time, a few of the more observant townsfolk noted a strange coincidence. The new sausage had appeared right after the salesman had vanished. It was a fleeting, uncomfortable thought, one that was quickly dismissed. This was Bartholomew. After all, the cheerful, kind-hearted butcher who had been a part of their lives for as long as anyone could remember. The idea of connecting him to anything sinister was preposterous. But the disappearances continued. A young couple camping in the woods, a hiker who had wandered off a marked trail, a drifter who had been looking for work at the local mill. They were all outsiders, people who wouldn't be missed, at least not in Havenwood. And with each disappearance, a new, uniquely flavored sausage would appear in Bartholomew's display case. The lover's link, the woodsman's joy, the drifter's dream. The names were whimsical, almost poetic, a stark contrast to the dark secret they held. The town remained blissfully ignorant, lulled into a false sense of security by the familiar smile of their beloved butcher and the addictive taste of his creations. They devoured the sausages, singing Bartholomew's culinary praises, all the while unaware that they were consuming the very essence of the missing people, their flesh and blood ground up and spiced into a ghoulish delicacy. Sheriff Brody, however, was a man of habit and observation, and the pattern, as subtle as it was, did not escape his notice. He was a believer in coincidence, but even he had to admit that this was stretching the bounds of probability. He began watching Bartholomew, not with suspicion at first, but with a growing sense of disquiet. He would linger in the butcher shop a little longer, his conversations with Bartholomew now peppered with carefully worded questions about where he sourced his meat. "New supplier, Bart?" Brody asked one morning, gesturing to a particularly plump and juicy-looking sausage. Bartholomew's smile didn't falter, but for a split second, Brody thought he saw a different glint in the butcher's eye, something cold and calculating. "Just a little side project of my own, Sheriff," Bartholomew replied smoothly. "A man's got to have his hobbies." The answer was vague, evasive, and it did nothing to quell the growing knot of unease in Brody's stomach. He began to look into Bartholomew's past, but the man's history was as clean as his butcher shop. He had inherited the shop from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The family had been a part of Havenwood since its founding. They were as much a part of the town's history as the ancient oak tree in the center of the square. But Brody couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The disappearances, the new sausages, the strange look in Bartholomew's eye was all starting to paint a picture so monstrous and unbelievable that Brody's rational mind struggled to accept it. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was beginning to take root in the dark, fertile soil of his imagination. The turning point came on a crisp autumn evening. Brody was driving home late after a long day of paperwork when he saw a light on in Bartholomew's shop. This was unusual. Bartholomew was a man of routine, and he always closed his shop at 6 o'clock sharp. Intrigued, Brody parked his car down the street and walked towards the shop. The front of the store was dark, but a dim glow emanated from the back room, where Bartholomew did his butchering. Brody slipped around to the back of the building. A high, grimy window, clouded with years of accumulated grease and dust, offered a limited view of the interior. Brody stood on an old wooden crate, his heart hammering in his chest, and peered inside. What he saw would be forever seared into his memory, a tableau of horror that would haunt his waking hours and turn his dreams into a gallery of nightmares. Bartholomew was there, his massive form silhouetted against the dim light. He was standing over a large stainless steel table, his back to the window. On the table was a form pale and still. Brody's blood ran cold as he realized it was a human body. It was a young woman, her long, dark hair matted with blood. Brody recognized her as a tourist who had been reported missing a few days prior. Bartholomew was humming a cheerful, off-key tune as he worked. He wielded a large cleaver with a terrifying precision, his movements fluid and practiced. He was butchering the woman's body with the same methodical skill he would use on a side of beef or a whole hog. The sight was so grotesque, so utterly beyond comprehension, that Brody felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He clapped a hand over his mouth to stifle a scream, his mind reeling in horror and disbelief. This was Bartholomew, the jolly butcher, the man who gave candy to children and always had a kind word for everyone. This was the man whose sausages he had been eating for years, whose sausages his wife and children loved. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The secret ingredient, the thing that made Bartholomew's sausages so unique, so addictive, was human flesh. Brody stumbled back from the window, his mind a chaotic vortex of horror and disgust. He leaned against the cold brick wall of the building, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to do something. He had to stop this monster. But how? He was one man against a beloved town figure, a man who had been feeding his unsuspecting neighbors the flesh of his victims for years. The idyllic facade of Havenwood had been shattered, revealing the dark and twisted reality that lay beneath. The savory aroma that had once been a source of comfort and joy now carried the stench of death and cannibalism. The town of Havenwood was not the peaceful, safe haven it appeared to be. It was a hunting ground, and its most beloved citizen was the predator. And Sheriff Brody, the man who had sworn to protect this town, was standing right in the middle of the monster's lair. The night was long, and the true horror of Bartholomew's meats and charcuterie was only just beginning to be revealed. The image of Bartholomew, the jolly butcher, dismembering a human being with the casual air of a man preparing dinner, was a brand on Sheriff Brody's soul. He drove home in a daze, the familiar streets of Havenwood now seeming alien and menacing. He stumbled into his house, his face a pale, clammy mask of shock. His wife, Mary, took one look at him and knew something was terribly wrong. He brushed off her worried questions with a mumbled excuse about a long day, but the lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back at the butcher shop window, a silent, horrified audience to a scene of unimaginable depravity. The cheerful tune Bartholomew had been humming, a jaunty, innocent little melody, now played on a loop in his mind, a grotesque soundtrack to a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The next morning, the sun rose over Havenwood, casting a golden glow on the picturesque town. But to Brody, the light only served to highlight the darkness he now knew was lurking beneath. He felt a profound sense of isolation. Who would believe him? He had no proof, only his word against that of a man who was, by all accounts, a town icon. To accuse Bartholomew of being a cannibalistic serial killer would be to invite ridicule and disbelief. They would think he had gone mad. He knew he had to proceed with caution. He needed proof, undeniable evidence that would rip away Bartholomew's jovial, respectable mask and expose the monster beneath. He spent the day in his office, door closed, poring over the missing persons reports. Old Man Hemlock, Arthur Penwright, the young couple, the hiker, the drifter, the tourist. The list was longer than he had realized, a silent testament to Bartholomew's reign of terror. He created a timeline, matching the dates of the disappearances with the first appearance of Bartholomew's new specialty sausages. The correlation was undeniable, a chillingly consistent pattern of death and consumption. He needed to get into the butcher shop to find something, anything, that would corroborate his horrific discovery. But how? Bartholomew's shop was his castle, a place where he was in complete control. Brody couldn't just get a search warrant based on a single, uncorroborated sighting through a dirty window. He needed something more concrete. His opportunity came a few days later, disguised as a town-wide power outage. A fierce thunderstorm had rolled through the valley, and a bolt of lightning had struck the town's main transformer, plunging Havenwood into darkness. Brody's mind, now sharpened by a desperate sense of urgency, immediately saw the potential. He knew that Bartholomew had a large, walk-in freezer in the back of his shop, a freezer that would be rendered useless without electricity. Under the guise of checking on local businesses, Brody made his way to Bartholomew's Meats and Charcuterie. He found the butcher at the front of the shop, lighting candles and bemoaning his potential loss of inventory. "Sheriff," Bartholomew said, his voice laced with a convincing amount of concern, "this is a disaster. I could lose thousands of dollars worth of meat if the power isn't restored soon." "I know, Bart," Brody said, his own voice steady despite the frantic hammering of his heart. "I'm doing what I can. I've called the power company, but they said it could be a while. Is there anything I can do to help?" Bartholomew wrung his hands, the very picture of a struggling small business owner. "I don't know, Sheriff. I just don't know. My freezer is packed to the gills." This was it. This was his chance. "Maybe I could take a look," Brody offered, his tone casual. "I'm no electrician, but I could see if there's a simple fix, a tripped breaker or something." Bartholomew hesitated for a moment, and in that brief pause, Brody saw a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. But the butcher's concern for his inventory seemed to override his caution. "Well," he said, "I suppose it couldn't hurt to look." He led Brody through the darkened shop, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the familiar smell of meat and spices, a smell that now turned Brody's stomach. Bartholomew unlocked the door to the back room, the very room where Brody had witnessed the gruesome dismemberment. It was clean, unnervingly so. The stainless steel table gleamed, and the floor had been scrubbed to a shine. But the memory of what he had seen in that room was a stain that no amount of cleaning could ever erase. Bartholomew led him to the walk-in freezer. It was a large, imposing metal box, its door secured with a heavy latch. As Bartholomew opened it, a blast of frigid air rushed out, carrying with it a different smell than the one in the main shop. It was the smell of cold, raw meat, but there was another underlying scent, a faint, coppery odor that Brody recognized with a jolt of horror. It was the smell of blood. The freezer was filled with animal carcasses, hanging from hooks in neat, orderly rows. There were sides of beef, whole hogs, and lambs. But at the back, shrouded in the dim, flickering light of Brody's flashlight, was something else. It was an area covered by a thick canvas tarp. "What's under there, Bart?" Brody asked, his voice a low, even tone that betrayed none of the turmoil raging inside him. Bartholomew's jovial facade finally began to crack. A nervous sweat beaded on his forehead, and his smile became a tight, strained grimace. "Oh, that's just some special orders," he said, his voice a little too high. "Some exotic game for some of my more discerning customers." Brody knew he was lying. He took a step towards the tarp, his hand resting on the butt of his service revolver. "I think I'd like to see for myself," he said, his voice now firm, authoritative. Bartholomew's eyes darted around the room, as if looking for an escape route. The friendly butcher was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. He took a step back, his hand reaching for a large meat hook that was hanging on the wall. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Bart," Brody said, his voice as cold as the air in the freezer. But Bartholomew was beyond reason. With a guttural roar, he lunged at Brody, the meat hook raised like a medieval weapon. Brody, who had been anticipating such a move, sidestepped the clumsy attack. Bartholomew, carried by his own momentum, stumbled and fell, his head hitting the concrete floor with a sickening thud. He lay there, stunned and groaning. Brody didn't hesitate. He quickly disarmed the butcher and slapped handcuffs on his wrists. Then, with his heart pounding in his chest, he turned his attention to the tarp. He took a deep, steadying breath and pulled it away. The sight that greeted him was an image from the deepest, darkest pits of hell. Hanging from hooks alongside the animal carcasses were human bodies. They were in various states of butchery, their pale, lifeless forms a grotesque parody of the animals they hung beside. Brody recognized the young female tourist, her body now partially dismembered. He saw what was left of the hiker, the drifter, and the young couple. And at the very back, he saw something that made him retch. It was the skeleton of a man, picked clean of its flesh, a few tattered remnants of a familiar, worn-out coat still clinging to the bones. It was Old Man Hemlock. The full, horrifying depravity of Bartholomew was laid bare before him. This was not just a murderer. This was a monster who had been feeding his friends and neighbors the flesh of his victims for years. The beloved Havenwood special, the hunter's delight, the traveler's treat, they were all part of a ghastly, cannibalistic feast. Brody stumbled out of the freezer, the stench of death and decay clinging to him. He radioed for backup, his voice trembling as he tried to articulate the horrors he had discovered. The arrival of his deputy, a young, fresh-faced officer named Miller, was a blur. He saw the shock and disbelief on the young man's face as he, too, saw what was in the freezer. The arrest of Bartholomew, the beloved butcher, sent a shockwave through Havenwood. The news spread like wildfire, a tidal wave of disbelief, denial, and horror. The townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They couldn't believe it. Not Bartholomew. Not the man who had been a pillar of their community, a man they had trusted and admired. But the evidence was undeniable. The bodies in the freezer, the missing persons reports, the chillingly consistent pattern of disappearances and new sausages. The grisly truth was a bitter pill to swallow, and it choked the idyllic town of Havenwood. The butcher shop, once a place of warmth and savory smells, was now a sealed-off crime scene, a monument to the dark secret it had hidden for so long. The investigation that followed was a grim, painstaking process. Forensic teams from the state police descended on the small town, their presence a stark reminder of the horrors that had been uncovered. They cataloged the remains, identified the victims, and pieced together the timeline of Bartholomew's ghoulish activities. The story that emerged was one of a deeply disturbed individual, a man who had been living a double life for years. He was a predator who had used his charm and his position in the community to lure his victims, primarily outsiders whose disappearance would not be immediately noticed. He had preyed on the vulnerable, the trusting, and the unsuspecting. For the people of Havenwood, The revelation was a devastating blow. They were forced to confront the unthinkable reality that they had been unwitting participants in a cannibalistic nightmare. The sausages they had savored, the meals they had shared, were all tainted with the blood of innocent victims. The thought was so repulsive, so profoundly disturbing, that it shook the very foundation of their community. Sheriff Brody, once a man who appreciated the simple, predictable rhythm of small-town life, was now a man who had seen the darkness that can hide behind a friendly smile. The idyllic image of Havenwood had been shattered, and he knew that the town and its people would never be the same. The shadow of Bartholomew, the twisted killer, would forever hang over their picturesque valley, a cold reminder that evil can wear the most familiar and unsuspecting of faces. The trial of the century was about to begin in the small town of Havenwood, and the world was about to learn the horrifying secret of Bartholomew's world-famous sausages. The trial of Bartholomew, the butcher of Havenwood, was a media circus. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs lined the streets of the small town, and reporters from across the country jostled for space in the cramped courtroom. The story was a sensation, a grisly fairy tale of a monster masquerading as a beloved small-town figure. It was a story that both horrified and fascinated the nation. For the people of Havenwood, the trial was a period of profound and painful introspection. The courtroom became a stage where the town's darkest secret was laid bare for the world to see. They sat on the hard wooden benches, their faces a mixture of shame, guilt, and a morbid curiosity, as the gruesome details of Bartholomew's crimes were paraded before them. They were forced to listen to the graphic testimony of forensic experts, to view post-mortem photographs of the victims, and to hear the cold, clinical confessions of the man they had once called a friend. Bartholomew, seated at the defendant's table, was a shadow of his former self. The rosy-cheeked smile was gone, replaced by a cold, vacant stare. He seemed to have shrunk, his once portly frame now gaunt and withered. He showed no remorse, no flicker of emotion, as the litany of his atrocities was read aloud. He was an empty shell of a man, his humanity long since devoured by the monster that resided within. The prosecution, led by a sharp, ambitious district attorney from the city, built their case methodically. They presented the physical evidence, the human remains found in the freezer, the traces of human DNA found on the butcher's tools, the meticulously kept journals in which Bartholomew had detailed his kills, referring to his victims not by name, but by the type of sausage he had made from their flesh. The journals were perhaps the most damning evidence of all, a cold, dispassionate account of a man who viewed his fellow human beings as nothing more than raw ingredients for his grotesque culinary creations. The defense, a court-appointed lawyer with a tired, defeated look in his eye, had little to work with. He attempted a plea of insanity, arguing that Bartholomew was a man driven by a deep and pervasive madness. He brought forth a parade of psychiatrists who testified to Bartholomew's profoundly disturbed psyche, to a mind that had blurred the lines between man and beast, between butcher and murderer. But the prosecution countered with its own team of experts, who painted a picture of a cunning, manipulative predator, a man who was not insane, but purely evil. They argued that his actions were not the result of a delusional mind, but of a cold, calculated decision to indulge in the ultimate taboo. He had chosen to kill, to butcher, and to consume not because he was mad, but because he enjoyed it. Sheriff Brody was the prosecution's star witness. He took the stand, his face grim and his voice steady, and recounted the events that had led to Bartholomew's arrest. He described his growing sense of unease, the pattern of disappearances, the strange new sausages. He told them about the night of the power outage, the look in Bartholomew's eye, the horrific discovery in the walk-in freezer. His testimony was powerful, a first-hand account of the moment when the idyllic facade of Havenwood was ripped away to reveal the slaughterhouse that lay beneath. During the cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to discredit Brody, to paint him as a small-town sheriff who was in over his head, a man who had jumped to conclusions. But Brody remained steadfast, his answers clear and unwavering. He was a man haunted by what he had seen, a man driven by a desperate need for justice for the victims. The trial dragged on for weeks, a grim spectacle that held the town, and the nation, captive. The people of Havenwood were forced to confront their own complicity in the horror. They had eaten the sausages, they had praised the butcher, they had been unwitting cannibals. The guilt was a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the town. Mrs. Gable, the baker, was said to have not baked a single loaf of bread since the arrest, her ovens cold and silent. The diner, once a bustling hub of gossip and laughter, was now a quiet, somber place where people picked at their food and spoke in hushed whispers. The town square, once the heart of the community, was now a place of quiet reflection, the statue of Ebenezer Croft looking down on a town that had lost its innocence. The climax of the trial came with Bartholomew's own testimony. Against the advice of his lawyer, he chose to take the stand. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with anticipation, as the butcher, the monster of Havenwood, finally spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, a stark contrast to the booming, hearty laugh that had once been his trademark. He confessed to everything, his words a cold, matter-of-fact account of his crimes. He spoke of the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of the kill, the artistry of the butchery. He described the flavors of his different victims, the unique textures of their flesh, the way he had blended their essence with his secret mixture of spices. He spoke not with remorse, but with a twisted sense of pride, the pride of a master craftsman describing his work. The courtroom listened in stunned silence, a collective wave of revulsion washing over the attendees. This was not a man pleading for his life or for their understanding. This was a monster bearing its soul, and the soul it revealed was a black, bottomless pit of depravity. The jury's deliberation was a mere formality. They returned with a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge, his face a mask of cold fury, sentenced Bartholomew to death. The sentence was met with a somber silence in the courtroom. There were no cheers, no cries of victory. There was only a profound sense of sadness, a sense of a deep and irreparable wound that had been inflicted upon the heart of their community. The day of Bartholomew's execution was a gray, overcast day, the sky a mirror of the mood in Havenwood. The town square was empty, the streets deserted. The people of Havenwood stayed in their homes, their doors locked, as if trying to shut out the final, grim chapter of the story that had consumed their lives. Sheriff Brody stood outside the state penitentiary, a silent witness to the end of the nightmare. He felt no sense of triumph or even relief. He felt only a deep, bone-weary sadness. The execution of Bartholomew would not bring the victims back. It would not erase the memory of what had happened, and it would not heal the deep psychological scars that had been inflicted upon his town. As he drove back to Havenwood, the first cold, cleansing drops of rain began to fall. He passed the old butcher shop, now boarded up and derelict, a decaying monument to the darkness that had once reigned within. He knew that the story of Bartholomew, the twisted killer, would forever be a part of Havenwood's history, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark to future generations. The town of Havenwood would eventually heal, but it would never be the same. The shadow of the butcher would always linger, a reminder of the fragility of innocence, and of the terrifying truth that the most monstrous secrets can be hidden behind the most ordinary of smiles. The savory aroma of sausage would never again drift across the town square, and the people of Havenwood would be forever haunted by the taste of the Havenwood Special and the horrifying knowledge of its secret ingredient. The final cut had been made, but the scars would forever remain.